As you can probably tell, I'm not Steve Ward, I'm Andy Mercer, his occasional co-host. Unfortunately this week, Steve wasn't able to put a show together, so, as before, I'm bringing you one of my old shows from my days of Radio Hermetica that used to be on the Paranormal UK radio network. I actually closed my little show down a couple of years back because I didn't really have the time to record as often as I wanted to, so I decided to can it after a few episodes, but I still have them, they're still lurking around in the background, so I thought I'd give you one of my old shows tonight to fill the space. Back in 2018, I was joined by a friend of mine, Jon Kaneko-James. Jon and I had talked about the magic of Shakespeare. I don't mean the fact that Shakespeare's plays are magical, but literally the examples of real magic to be found in Shakespeare's works. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. Also, I'd like to apologise for some technical problems regarding the sound quality. Back in those days, my home setup wasn't quite as good as it is now, so the sound does vary a little bit in places and there's some background noise, for which I apologise in advance. Anyway, hopefully Steve will be back for the next show in 2 weeks' time, but in the meantime, enjoy a little trek down memory lane.
Book of the Dead.
Welcome to another edition of Radio Hermetica on the Paranormal UK radio network. I'm your host for the night, Andy Mercer, and my guest tonight is a friend of mine, Jon Kaneko-James. Jon is an author and researcher based in London. His works have included children's books, articles on popular history topics, genre fiction and historical research. Jon's particular research topic has been the historic belief in the supernatural and how people believed and what they believed and the criteria for those experiences. Jon at the moment is working at a fantastic location in London, which he can tell you more about himself in a few moments, and is also closely related to the book that he has recently completed, which will be published soon. But before we go into all that, I'll let Jon just tell you a bit more about himself. Jon, over to you. The first thing I want to ask you, Jon, actually, is how do you pronounce your double-barreled surname?
Right now, I'm going to be entirely honest with you. I might be about to mispronounce it too.
Oh, blimey.
Because it is my wife's surname, and I took it up when we got married, partly because I sort of believe that, it's not the 17th century anymore. My wife isn't my property, and therefore she shouldn't have to adopt my surname. Partly because of a conversation with my father-in-law where he was wonderfully poignant and dramatic and sort of said, that name will now be dead. All of the children of my generation are daughters. And I subsequently then found out that my Japanese surname is basically the Smith of Japan. And that I didn't know it well enough then, but my father-in-law's just a big drama queen. And so it's Kaneko.
Kaneko.
And I most often pronounce it as Kaneko, which has a bit too much texture in it, because I'm Welsh and I go up and down a lot. Mm-hmm. And the stress on Kaneko, it should be more or less flat, I believe.
Right. Well, I've called you Kaneko-James before. I do apologise for that.
Oh, God, loads of people do. Don't worry. The various permutations of it that come up.
Well, funny enough, actually, my wife's surname is the same as that, in that her own version is going to die out because there's no one of the same surname that's going to be left after sort of this generation passes away, but her name's Cohen, so there's quite a few Cohens that are around, so that's not going to die out completely, but certainly her version, her branch is disappearing too. And I don't know if I mentioned before, I'm half Welsh, my dad's Welsh, so although I don't sound it. Obviously, you're from Wales. Whereabouts originally?
I am from Llanelli, home of the Scarlets, and a very, very good theatre.
Excellent. So, how did you end up in London?
Oh God, it was a few things. I ended up dropping out of law school for a few different reasons. One of which being, by the way, there was a period where law jobs really bottomed out, and that really sort of disheartened me. And it was around the time my father passed away. It was a lot of things. I dropped out, and then I did a bit of photography for a living for a while. And then, just the economy in Wales was contracting and contracting and contracting. So it got to the point where I decided to come to London and go back to university and do comparative religion at SOAS. And from there I ended up running a bookshop. And from there I ended up at the Globe.
Yes, we're getting on to that. For those who are listening, my good friend John works at the Globe Theatre in London, which is a reproduction of the original Shakespeare theatre. It's pretty much on the site of the original one, isn't it?
We're about a 2-minute walk away. Sadly, the original site, about a third of it, is under the main southern structural stanchion of Southwark Bridge.
Ah, right.
Not deliberately, just at the time they didn't realise what they were doing. I think it was about 70 or 80 years before a historian just did a bit of a desktop survey, and by sort of, just looking at all the paperwork and looking through generations of old plans for things, and then just realising, oh my God, what have we done? And so we're as close as it's possible to be, basically.
Right. I suppose it's one of those things. It's also a fairly modern thing, the whole idea of trying to preserve history as we do today. Until not that long ago, they weren't that bothered, were they, really?
Oh, crumbs, no. I mean, and even when you get the very early kind of antiquarian/archaeologists, a friend who is an archaeologist told me a story of, like, a really early 18th century guy using explosives like gunpowder to blast open these barrows, because he just wanted to get at the trinkets quicker.
Good Lord. It's quite terrifying when you think about the kind of damage that's been done that's just lost now and can't be rescued. It is really quite frightening.
Oh, God, totally. There are so many things that are obliterated. But it can happen with documents as well. A lot of the Elizabethan spy networks were run by this chap called, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, Thomas Phillips. And it's spelled Phillips, but I think it's Phillips. Yeah. And he kept astoundingly good notes, but unfortunately they were destroyed in a flood of the Tower of London's basements in the 19th century.
Oh dear.
And so we have like a tiny number of what was actually there.
Oh,
and it's a shame, because one of his diaries one of his sort of commonplace books describes he was trying to crack various codes that were being used to communicate with Mary, Queen of Scots.
Okay.
And he just got into a place where he thought, I need to understand the minds of her and the people around her. So he went to the estate where she was being held. And, of course, her people in France, Thingamy of Guise, basically they were telling her, we've got people working. And the two diaries, Phillips's diary and Mary's diary, synchronise because she sees Phillips walking the grounds of the house where she's being kept, and he's trying to get a little bit method about it and understand her to crack the code. But she thinks he's an agent working for her, and so she smiles and waves at him. And he sort of smiles and waves back, and then you've got both sides of that interaction who wrote in their diaries, him sort of going, I wonder what that was about. We've got to move a bit quickly. And her going, oh my God, maybe I'm going to be free.
Blimey. Slight misunderstanding, to say the least.
Oh, yes.
It's interesting because, of course, preservation of records brings a little bit on to one of my main interests, as you know, Dr. John Dee, where some of his research was destroyed, unfortunately, either placed underneath pyres, as in pies, cooked pies, or used to burn to start pyres in fires, basically, was the person who took possession of these chests not long after he died. They didn't know what they had, and this woman apparently found a secret hatch in the chest and lots of paperwork in it, and then she proceeded to use it to, say, either wrap in pies or just use to start fires. It's not entirely clear. It was fortunately rescued not that long afterwards, burnt before they realised what on earth she was actually burning, and then thankfully they were rescued after that. But yes, so you end up working at the Globe Theatre. How on earth did that come about?
Right. Well, what happened was that the bookshop was always... It was one of these things. It was a small bookshop. Because of the way the rota worked, I was pretty much always on my own. We had one person come in for half of the day, another person come in for the other half of the day. And so you're always on your own in a shop. And after a while, that got really wearing. Like, for example, I because there was no one else to do it, I ended up working multiple shifts with, like, illnesses that probably I should have either stayed off sick or gone to hospital for. Like, I worked multiple shifts with full-on serious actual food poisoning.
Oh, Lord.
One of the previous staff had passed out. And by the way, my employer didn't expect me to do it, but the fact is there was no one else to do it. And there were other sort of things as well, because all the tech there was very old. The building was sort of in a little bit of a state. It's been repaired now and it looks lovely. But they had no effective heating.
Oh, God.
And so when the winter would come, it would be virtually the same temperature inside as outside. And after 3 winters of this, I did get to the point where I was like, I have to do something else.
Yeah.
And from there I ended up at the Globe.
Right. So what is it you do there?
Right, I am a tour guide. I also work in the exhibition, sort of facilitating and literally just making it happen and sort of scheduling tours and working upstairs, bringing people in. I've also just written a tour for them, which will be a Globe product that's going to be sold really soon, and I train people as well.
Excellent. So I'm guessing you've met one or two famous faces who've performed there?
Right, I met for I think I've shared 14 words with Stephen Fry,
Right.
which were mostly, "Oh, this way, sir." "Oh, yes, sorry, this way." "No, this way." "Yep, just that door there." Or some variation of that. I have been within 30 feet of David Tennant.
Right.
The longest conversation I've ever had with somebody famous was Brian Blessed, when he was emceeing an event in the exhibition, which is where I work.
Right.
And that's probably the longest conversation I've had with a famous person, except for when weirdly, I tweeted this earlier, when Sylvester McCoy came up to me when I was standing outside one afternoon and asked if he and his family could have a tour. And I was immediately starstruck. Unfortunately, they couldn't, because it was literally the middle of a show.
Right.
But yes, the sad thing is, though, with it being a theatre, I get to see shows. I work in the heritage side of it, which takes place in literally a lightless basement full of cosmological and magical symbols.
Right.
Which means that, and we have a world tree. We have a giant artificial tree with a sort of brass owl sitting in it.
Right.
Which holds the ceiling up because it's built around a structural pillar. And I don't get to see all the theatre stuff. I'll meet them too much because I dwell in the darkness and they dwell in the light.
I like that. I assume you're not gone deaf from talking to Brian Blessed then?
Oh, God, no. But he is an amazing chap.
Yeah, absolutely. For our American listeners, he's very well known over here for having a very loud voice. He's also done quite a bit of Shakespeare as well, hasn't he? And Sylvester McCoy, if you don't recognise him, if you're an old fan of Doctor Who, he was one of the classic Doctors, as they get called these days, as opposed to the new reboot. So, yeah, a couple of interesting people, certainly. But one of the most interesting things I wanted to talk to you about, of course, is the fact you have written a book, which is quite close to the whole thing to do with the Globe Theatre. It's to do with Shakespeare, isn't it?
Absolutely. My big interest, you see, as a historian, is what people believed, how much they believed, and what were the conditions of their belief when it came to the supernatural. If that makes sense, because you see things like, for example, the fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream and the demons. I mean, and there are demon and exorcism references in multiple Shakespeare plays that are, I don't think even one of them is actually directly supernatural. It just crops up as a thing in their lives. And so I've written my book, which is called, This Isle is Full of Monsters, Shakespeare's Audience and the Supernatural, just exploring for a few different topics what the supernatural would have meant to the people standing in the Globe Theatre, or maybe sitting indoors at his indoor theatre, the Blackfriars, watching Shakespeare's plays or other plays of the time.
So what gave you the idea in the first place?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question.
That's a good delaying tactic. You're not quite sure what to say next, isn't it?
Yeah, but no, it's because I'm trying to remember where this started, to be honest. To be honest, I think where it started, if I try to think back, is I've always had an interest in the history of magic and magical texts. I mean, I remember, I think I can't have been older than about 21, 22, when the first of the Societas Magica sort of magic and history volumes came into the little Waterstones in Swansea.
Right.
And I bought those avidly and read them. And and I'd read sort of pagan books, and I'd read a lot of Golden Dawn, sort of from a magical perspective books before. And those are my private religious beliefs. That's another matter. However, these books, like I think it's Robert Klassner, it might be Richard Kiefer's Forbidden Rites, which is all the articles going into the Munich book, you know. And that sort of got me. I remember that was when I sort of was like, oh my God, I have to learn Latin. And because I was so excited just by looking at the original text reproduced of the Munich book. And I think it started there. But from there, I found myself thinking, because I also read a lot of the pamphlets and a lot of the books written by the elites of their times, sort of putting, saying this is what it is. And of course, after a while, you start to find yourself thinking, is that how it is, really? I wonder, how many people could even read this book by this guy? Of those, how many people believed it? What did everybody else think? And so I started trying to answer those questions for myself. I got to do talks in various places. And when I was approached by the publisher, and I'm sorry to any Scots listening to this, right, because I'm going to try and pronounce it properly, but I am a Welshman, Bealaithris.
Right.
A Scottish folklore and history publisher. When I was approached by Bealaithris, I sort of had probably about half of the book already written.
Right. So it was, once you have that interest, you find it does give you greater impetus to get working, doesn't it? Rather than just sort of writing in a vacuum almost. In someone's interest, you think, oh, that makes me more interested in getting it really moving forward. So tell us a bit more about the book itself. I mean, we mentioned briefly kind of what it covers, but what in more detail can you tell us about it? Because just to let our listeners know, I did a little bit of proofreading on a couple of the more esoteric bits and pieces, and I found it absolutely fascinating reading through. And I found there's a lot of information packed into a relatively short book, although it's pretty good. It's just, tell us more about the kind of detail of the book.
Yes, of course. Basically, I didn't want it to end up being one of those books that somebody takes 20 years over. I do think I will one day write that sort of book, but not this one. And to be honest, it even originally started off with the idea that I'd publish my collected talks and I'd just have something to virtually give away to people whenever they came to a talk. But I couldn't leave it alone, because that's my nature. And so what I've done is I've chosen some of the main supernatural themes of early modern theatre, and I've gone into basically what they would have meant in cognitive terms to people. So what did people believe, what did they feel they were experiencing, and into the historical and social context of the time. So I start with magicians. I look at sort of who the real magicians were in their society, who really was going about identifying them as a magician, practicing magic. Then I do look at as well some fictional magicians, and I do some slightly obscure ones. Like I do the Merry Devil of Edmonton, who is a sort of an English Faustus.
Right.
And but he has a much happier ending, by the way, because that play is basically a romantic comedy, and he's kind of just the guy that helps the young lovers to get together, and he's sort of actually quite a positive figure, because as a magician he's able to kick over the status quo and sort of make sure the weak people who weren't going to get justice, which I quite like. But then I look at Prospero, and sort of, is Prospero an accurate magician of his time? what sort of magician is he? Where does he sit in the progression of an early modern magician? Because whereas sort of Marlowe's Faustus, who I also very slightly look at, but I didn't want to get too bogged down. But Marlowe's Faustus is a pre and during ritual magician. So, we see his magical efforts, and then we see him sort of make the pact and contract with Mephistopheles, and then we sort of see his use of his powers and his adventures. And Prospero kind of fits into that framework. But whereas the late acts, I think it's Act 3 in Faustus, where the adventures begin, and you get this weird, crazy set of episodes where Faustus is travelling in time and shit and things. And Prospero's in that phase. That's where we meet Prospero, because he's already got the spirit Ariel. He doesn't really need ritual magic tools to do things. I mean, he has his staff that is, to my knowledge, only really name-checked at the end.
Yeah.
When he decides to, sort of break his staff and drown his books and things, I think that's the only time he really mentions it. So he doesn't need the staff for power. He has Ariel, the spirit that does the magic for him. And then I look at, of course, well, although most people doing magic, the vast majority were either clerics or self-educated middle-class people, how realistic would it have been for a duke to try and be a magician, really? And so we just look through some magical texts of the era. I look at the strictures they put on you as a magician, and then I compare it to Prospero's description of why he was kicked out as Duke of Milan. And, yeah, to be honest, it more or less tallies up. That if you were doing all the stuff in the magic books, you wouldn't be a functional ruler. Because, it requires so much from you.
Yes.
All of the abstinence from various things and things you wouldn't even think you had to abstain from. The clothing requirements, would that really be suitable to be the Duke of somewhere? All of that stuff. And the isolation requirements. Lots and lots of the spells had very tough requirements for isolation. And some of them were very antisocial forms of isolation, like leaving all urban settlements and things. And so I look at that and say that basically, to be honest, if Prospero was a duke trying to be a magician, he probably deserved to be kicked out of Milan.
I mean, it's certainly true of medieval magic. It often requires a lot of effort, a lot of planning, a lot of time, as you quite say, on your own consecrated areas away from other people, disappearing off for days at a time, and then also probably ruler of a particular area. You would have a hard time marrying those two up, unless, of course, you can be false and take shortcuts and just ask for direct help from Mephistopheles. Of course, that's the legend. What do you think about the idea that Shakespeare based Prospero on John Dee?
Now, here is the thing about John Dee. Now, this is an interesting conversation for the two of us to have. Because I'm going to ask you something.
Sure.
How famous in his own time was John Dee?
It's an interesting, because it is a good question. One of the things that is quite obvious with historians up until very recently is they almost try to write him out of the history of the Elizabethan times, trying to make him pretty much invisible because of perceived embarrassment about the so-called witch of Enochian magic that he was known for. But he was certainly a close friend of the Queen Elizabeth I. He'd often go to his house and visit in Mortlake and have private sessions of discussion. So anybody who was in court would have known who John Dee was. It was certainly no secret of his direct connections with the Queen, even down to the point where she went to him to find the correct date for her coronation, to be a long successful coronation, which of course it was. So yes, he was pretty famous in royal circles, sort of hierarchy at that time, definitely. But as I say, the problem is many books up until very recently written about Elizabeth I and that period almost write him out of history completely, and it's only recent of authors and writers of history of that particular time frame that would put him back into where he should be. But yeah, no, he was certainly very well known at the time.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, because my thing with you, the reason I ask you that is because we must always be wary to separate context of the time from what we now have. And one of the things about Dee is that because his records his stuff has survived comparatively well, like for example, there's one chap called, I think he's referenced, called Gresham, who seems to have been quite famous, but we have nothing survived him but his name.
Right.
But with Dee, we've got a lot of stuff. We've lost stuff too, I know.
Yes.
But we've got a lot of stuff about Dee. And so we know a lot of stuff about Dee as people of the 21st and 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And so my thing is, just because we know all this about Dee, I don't know if Londoners and Shakespeare knew that about Dee. Because, for example, the magician mentioned much more often in the early modern theatre world is Simon Foreman.
Yes, yes.
However, I don't feel that Prospero is based upon Simon Foreman.
Right.
Because Foreman's just wrong. He doesn't strike the chords for Prospero. For Dee, maybe there's some reference in there to Dee having to Dee's flight from England.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, it's possible that it was a tug in the back of Shakespeare's mind.
Yes. Yeah.
What I would also say, though, is that Prospero is very much the sort of wizard figure that you see in a lot of the romances and the earlier romances as well. And so if there's a sort of an inspiration for him, I reckon it's the sort of wizard you see in the earlier romances.
Right.
I reckon if you want a Dee-inspired figure in early modern kind of playgoing, Faustus is basically a sort of John Dee, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
Like some parts of Faustus's life and achievements are very Dee resonant. Right. And others are very, very Agrippa resonant.
Sure. Well, certainly things like Prospero's books. We know very much that Dee had one of the most extensive libraries of any kind, pretty much in the Western world. But certainly he had a huge collection of occult material and manuscripts, which he was, quite closely guarded. Which is always the odd thing when he leaves off to go off to Europe. He just leaves his house sort of locked up, and it's all this material's in the house, and it gets broken into, gets stolen while he's in Europe.
Yes.
So, but again, as you say, that idea of him sort of taking flight and leaving off, going off into Europe, which of course is what Dee does at the invitation of there's the Polish Mileski, not Mileski, he's a 1920s gangster.
Yeah.
The chap's name, but a Polish remember Polish sort of nobility invites him across into Europe.
He's in my book. I can't remember his name either.
No, it's not Mileski, that's for certain.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that can parallel the idea of old Prospero sort of disappearing off as well. But I mean, that comes to the other question, of course, is how well known and how famous was Shakespeare in his time? He seems to know an awful lot about high court and how it all operated, and there is always that question of how did he know all this stuff about things like the Danish court, for example, with Hamlet, and sort of our own high circles.
Well,
it's an interesting question, I always thought.
This is one of the big misconceptions, though, because here's the thing. I mean, number one, all of these courts of Europe were the Kardashians of their era.
Mm-hmm.
They were incredibly famous on a popular level. They had all the cool clothes. They had all the daring exploits. And so it's not like knowing a lot about government now or popular culture, or royal culture now.
Mm-hmm.
They were much more famous. But the other thing with Shakespeare is a lot of this stuff he just kind of adapts. I mean, Hamlet, he didn't invent the story of Hamlet. It existed in Europe as a story for a long while before Shakespeare was around.
Mm-hmm.
Shakespeare's Hamlet is an adaptation, and so are a lot of his stories. They come from continental, like Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet was the third English language Romeo and Juliet. And it was about the fifth or sixth Romeo and Juliet to exist anywhere, with editions existing in French and Italian as well as English.
Right.
And you can even tell, by the way, which Romeo and Juliet Shakespeare read.
Okay.
Because there's a specific English language one that brings in the nurse, and no other versions have the nurse.
Ah, I see.
And that's what Shakespeare was. He was a prolific reader. One of my colleagues and friends at the Globe, she did her master's on mentions of disease and infection in Shakespeare.
Right.
And obliquely through that Masters, you can show how voracious a reader Shakespeare was, because so many phrases from these books about disease and plagues, and some of them lurid, some of them quite technical, by the way, would end up in sort of Shakespeare plays. And for the dates, you can see it was that way around. And I mean, to be honest, some of the plays he wrote, if you look at the diaries of the owner of the Rose Theatre opposite the Globe, plays like the Scottish play, plays like, not the Jew of Malta, the Shakespeare one, the Merchant of Venice, and all of that, versions of those were on at the Rose years before Shakespeare wrote them.
Right, okay.
And he obviously was either tapping into a pop culture thing, or he was sort of basically nicking it and writing it for someone else. He was more than this seeded person in the heart of the establishment, although he did get very popular. He was a voracious reader and a judicious, I'm going to be polite to the Shakespeare sphere, adapter.
Fair enough. What is it would you say then that makes him so much more popular than other writers of that time? Why is he the one that's endured more than others? What is it, do you think, is particular to his way of writing, his storytelling, if you like, that made him so much more successful historically?
Simplest thing of all, I would say, is that his plays are mostly just better plays. I mean, I'm into this area. Even for my book, I went through a lot of obscurities. And to be honest with you, Shakespeare's plays are well-written drama. The stories are good. The characters make sense. The things that happen, they are in a language that is now a little difficult for us, but they carry you through. At the time, they were written in the vernacular as well. And one of the things is, although for example, he might only have been adapting Romeo and Juliet, he was probably of the three British writers that did it, including him, he was the best writer. Because I've read them, and his version is the best written version. And that was the thing, basically. Even though maybe it's possible to say a lot of his stuff wasn't very original, it doesn't matter, because he was a good writer. And in fact, one of the reasons his language is a little harder for us to understand is because he was writing in the vernacular of the street, whereas more sort of artsy, academic-y writers like John Lilly, their stuff is easier for you to understand because it's a more rarefied form of English. But to be honest, they're just not as good plays.
Fair enough.
Sorry, carry on.
No, you can.
Well, like the Witch of Edmonton, I've used the Witch of Edmonton relatively kind of heavily in my book because it's got some wonderful quotes in it about how witches work in society. And so there's a wonderful, in fact, I've got it in front of me. So this is from Act 4, Scene 1, The Witch of Edmonton, right?
Yeah.
First line. Here's none now, Mother Sawyer, but this gentleman, myself, and you. Let us have some mild questions, and you mild answers. Tell us honestly and with free confession. We'll do our best to wean you from it. Are you a witch or no? Mother Sawyer, I am none. The Justice, be not so furious. Mother Sawyer, I am none. None but base curs so bark at me. I'm none, or would I were. If every poor woman be trod on thus by slaves, reviled, kicked, beaten, as I am daily, she to be revenged had need to turn witch. And that's a wonderful line about what witches are. However, as a play, it's not a great play.
You make it sound so good that you're reading.
Oh, thank you very much.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
Oh, thank you very much, but it's dull.
Fair enough, save us the trouble of reading it then. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about as well, there's quite a long section, or a couple of sections dealing with the idea of demons. Now, it's interesting because we previously met at a conference in Boscastle last year where you were one of the speakers are talking more around about curses, but I know there was sort of briefly talked about demons then as well. It's interesting. What first of all, what would you say was Shakespeare's own view of or Shakespeare's view of magic to begin with? What would you say was his a view of such things?
Now, there were a couple of figures within early modern theatre who you can tell were genuinely interested. One of them is a chap I mentioned for a second earlier, John Lilly. John Lilly was obviously interested in the esoteric and the theological. I'm not going to say he was a practitioner, we can't know that. But, he was interested in it. Mm-hmm. Ben Jonson owned a couple of magical books, although he was a skeptic. I do wonder if he was a skeptic after having tried things and had gotten no luck out of them, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yes.
Jonson, The Alchemist, The Devil is an Ass, he is fascinated with devils and demons, even though with The Alchemist he takes the piss out of every possible form of supernatural practitioner he can write. Still, you can see he's interested. However, with Shakespeare, I've got to be honest, thinking through his portrayals of the supernatural, Shakespeare was interested in magic sort of in a very sort of Avengers Assemble sort of way. In about the same level as the writers of the Thor comics and things
right.
are interested in Norse mythology, basically.
Yeah.
Because most often magic in a Shakespeare play is basically a big red button with the words advance plot by pressing this written on it.
Yes, I was going to say a plot device, very much.
Yes, literally a transparent plot device. However, that's his view seemingly on magic. Now, he has some really interesting views on demonic possession.
Uh-huh.
Now, I would personally say that he was a skeptic. And in fact, this is me this is probably me sticking my neck out the furthest you'll ever see me. But I think from the things that are written in Twelfth Night, in the play Twelfth Night, because the character Malvolio in Twelfth Night, he sort of, they sort of do a bit of making everyone think he's mad and that he's gone insane and he gets locked up and they lampoon that he's possessed. But some of the things said in that scene are reminiscent of things that a writer and cleric called Samuel Halsnet, who was the Bishop of London's confessor, that he wouldn't write in a book for 2 years.
Right.
And then when that book did come out 2 years later, Shakespeare's King Lear comes out after it, and it's full of references to that book. And so Samuel Halsnet was basically the sort of Puritan smasher general in some ways. He was releasing all of these books against John Darrell, the big Lancashire Puritan exorcist. And so, or was it just general North of England? Yeah, either way. John Darrell, the big sort of North of England Puritan exorcist. And I think Shakespeare had either read his books, but even possibly was friends with him, or at least had some sort of relationship with him to be using material that would come up in Darrell's book later. Of course, it's possible that Darrell simply went to see Twelfth Night and was like, yeah, that's really good.
Kind of reverse the whole thing, yeah.
But either way, Shakespeare had opinions about demonic possession, and he basically thought that it was rubbish.
Fair enough.
Carry on.
That's fair enough. That's more modern thinking. I think you're probably quite right as well. And I've discussed on many occasions with many people about demonic possession and obviously mental illness. And the two have been mixed together quite a lot over the years to try and explain abnormal behaviour with us understanding human psychology. Now we have a better understanding idea of how human psychology works. You'd think the idea of demonic possession may have gone out the window completely, but it still continues to be a belief system, which is a shame.
Yeah.
But it's what works for people. Some people find the idea of they're demonically possessed, and if they have an exorcism, they feel better. If they feel better, great. That's all that really matters at the end of the day.
Well, that's the thing.
And it's whether they possess the demon in the first place is another matter entirely. But there is I wanted to talk to you a bit more about also a particular section about this transforming ghosts into demons, sort of Calvin and Luther.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting. I'll perhaps you tell us a bit about that section particularly, because I think that's quite fascinating. Oh,
yes, absolutely. Well, this is the thing. Oh, actually, by the way, later on, I'd like to go back to demonic possession and psychology as well. But Calvin and Luther and ghosts... And there's a little bit of a Venn diagram when it comes to the dead in the sort of after the Reformation. And sort of Calvin and Luther, very much against all of the superstition of the Catholic Church, most cynically to break the power of the chantries and to break the sentimental hold the Catholic Church had over people. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, one of the big things about the Catholic Church is that you can intercede for your dead relatives who are in purgatory. You can have prayers said for them to make their bonds easier. You say masses for them. There are lots of remembering the dead sort of ceremonies that still go on in Spain, for example. Mm-hmm. And so if you can sort of break that hold, that sentimental hold the Catholic Church has on people's dead relatives, it's easier to steer them away from the church. Also, the money given to the chantries... especially by the very, very sort of rich and the nobles and things, that was a serious income for the church. So there's that very cynical aspect of Calvin and Luther not believing really in ghosts. But there it was also a solid theological lineage to what they were saying. Right. That essentially ghosts the spirits of human beings could not return from the afterlife. Uh-huh. Once they're up there, they're gone. They can't appear to you. If you have a dream with, for example, your dead parent that's a dream. Right. Or you're mad and you're sort of hallucinating from melancholy. Or you are looking at a demon in human form who has come to meddle and to do sort of things they shouldn't. And that was another thing that was put on necromancers and magicians, that basically even if a necromancer or magician said he could get you contact with your dead relative, with a dead friend or whatever, he can't really. He's just getting his demon to assume human form. Right, yeah. And that came out of Calvin and Luther. It was a popular elite belief in England. But, I mean, there's a relatively decent amount of evidence that at a grassroots level, people still more or less sort of believed in ghosts. Mm-hmm. But that's how that is, sadly. Well, not sadly, but that's how that is. There's always a disconnect between the very top of the elite and sort of the grassroots people on the ground, even now. Oh, yeah. I think, Professor Chris French would have a very different view about ghosts to people attending a paranormal night at Coney Hatch or sort of that nuclear bunker and Kelvin Hatch, rather.
Kelvin Hatch, I've been there a few times myself, actually. I have a little confession about I was one of the very first investigations ever at that place. It happened to be that the relative of one of our group was the owner of the site.
Oh, very cool.
It was kind of a conversation suggesting to him that he could open up to the public at night as well as during the daytime, because he was pretty much gifted the bloody place by the Ministry of Defence when they closed it down. So we were one of the very earliest. And it is an odd location. There's some strange stuff there, but that's on the side. I think also comparing Chris French to when he first started out would be a very different Chris French, because I think he was a bit of a believer to begin with, and his scepticism grew more and more as he investigated, as far as I can remember. I might be mistaken with somebody else.
No, you're correct, because he said as much at the last ASAPCon in his paper. So, and that's another thing about sort of people in general. Their views change over their lives. Like, for example, with Ben Jonson, I would put money on the fact that Jonson didn't have a magical book as a curious skeptic originally. I reckon he probably had a go at some point in his life, and it was that experience of going through it that possibly made him a skeptic.
Yes.
But, I mean, that hinterland, they're talking about ghosts again, between the ghost and the demon and mental illness, that is part of a debate that has been going on since before Ian suspects. Because, you know what you're saying about people in the modern era, You'd think that with greater knowledge of psychology, that we would have vanquished the idea of demonic possession. Do you know in 1566 there was... it was 1599. The 1566 case was the successful one. But by 1599, there was a French surgeon called Marescot arguing exactly what you're saying, that this particular person who thought they were possessed, and in fact probably all people who thought they were possessed, were basically just suffering mental illnesses. There was an English doctor, I think it was Dr. Jordan, who said the same thing, who wrote a big book called On the Suffering of the Mother, more or less, which was about, again, mental illness causing demonic possession. In fact, even within the church, there was one late 16th century French demoniac. And a bishop an archbishop exorcised her, but he did it in the form of an actual double-blind experiment. So what he did is he did his blessing over one bowl of water, and he then exorcised her with a non-consecrated bowl of water. And he read out some Latin from the Bible without telling her it was from the Bible and sort of letting her believe it was something else. And then he exorcised her with, like, the opening chapter of Virgil.
Right.
And he successfully produced exorcism phenomena in her with the chapter of Virgil and the normal water, and he persuaded... Basically, he got her to drink an entire glass of holy water without flinching or suffering. And that was late 16th century France. And so there's always been that dialogue.
Yes.
In possession. Or at least, I wouldn't say always, but for a very long time there certainly has been.
Of course, there's also Johann Wehr's book, De Prestatious Demon, which I can almost get right sometimes, which even Freud recommended recognised as being one of the top 10 most important books ever written, where Wehr was essentially saying that it is all just imagination, and it could well be a mental illness that's causing all this, witchcraft particularly, but also that involves possession as well. So that's another important text. So as you quite rightly said, the idea that it's not really demonic possession isn't just a modern thing. It's been around for a while, but unfortunately because it goes against the church, we know how powerful the church used to be, it tends to be kind of pushed to one side and often seen almost as proof of demonic possession, because you're claiming they're not possessed by demons, so therefore you must be possessed, which is rather ridiculous. But I've certainly read that kind of thing as well, definitely.
It's the trouble when a sort of an idea like that turns in on itself to protect itself. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately. And again, that exact narrative that you just said, again, that was one of the narratives being bandied about by the Puritan exorcists against people like Halsnet, who was writing books saying that it's all rubbish and the ones who aren't fakers are mentally ill. And, the main defence was, yes, but, that's the Church of Satan. That's the devil-infiltrated, sort of vainglorious Church of England, which is sort of a mixture of a bit too Catholic and a bit too sort of devilish.
Mm-hmm. It's quite amazing really what little twists and turns you uncover when people try to argue and counter-argue particular points, and you think, okay, but that's easy to say, but what more can you say about something like that? It's the game playing, isn't it, if you like, we are the correct ones, we have the right to real information, we are the ones to believe in, you're wrong, and if you're wrong, therefore you are the devil in disguise.
Oh, Lord, yes. And it's one of those things with any idea, if there's no point where you ever hear somebody say, I don't know, then I think in any idea of any kind, you should be very suspicious. And if you ever push somebody to the point where what they should say is, I don't know, and instead they tell you that you've done something wrong, I think with religion, with anything, that is another point to be very suspicious of what you're being told. Yeah. And yeah, you see it in all aspects. You certainly see it in this sphere that we research.
Indeed. It's obviously often about the power and control of individuals over individuals. You're doing this, not doing it right. I am. Therefore, you should be following me, and I know what I'm doing. And by the way, pay for me. Pay me to teach this stuff. It's like, okay, I mean, there are good teachers who teach esoteric material out there, without a doubt. But there's also quite a few that you think, do you actually even know what you're talking about? Much less teaching somebody else that stuff. It's quite alarming. But it's one of those fields, as we can say, talking what we were saying before about John Dee being exorcised out of history because of his occult. The occult still, even now, is seen by most people outside of it. It's just a bunch of loonies at best and demonically possessed at worst. So why would you expect a rigour of investigation and a high level of critique work being done? You talk about nonsense and rubbish, so why would it be, why would there be any kind of academic work involved? But of course that's not the case. It is something that's becoming more and more recognised that there's something to this stuff. Whether you believe in the true supernatural or believe it's all psychological is another question, of course, but it's not something you can just simply ignore and pretend doesn't exist, because there's too much out there.
Oh gosh, totally. In fact, interestingly, on that topic of the sort of aspects of people being excised from history and dismissed, one of my little hobby horses, just in the sense that I'd love to have a grant to sit down and just do this for a year, but that's probably never going to happen, is female grimoire magicians.
Yes, that would be interesting.
Now, sadly, because they are very marginalised figures, I mean, they are not even a full subset of women. They're sort of a subset of a subset of a subset, because they are literate women, who there are not that many. In London, I think it's about just under 1 in 10 women would have been literate. Yeah. And London was very literate. That was like the most literate place in Britain in 1600, for example. And of those 1 in 10, how many would have been involved in grimoire magic? Well, probably not even as many as 1 in 10. But you can still see signs that these women existed.
Yeah.
And I sort of found someone I believe to be one in Rye in 1607, a woman called Anna Taylor. And I wrote a little bit on my blog about her. Because if you go through with books like VB 26, for sale as the Book of Oberon,
yes,
which is a magical book with a lot of fairy magic in it, and if you look at some of the fairy magic manuscripts collected by the great, Catherine Briggs,
yes,
you can see that this woman, Anna Taylor, was doing fairy magic. She was doing grimoire magic. And then there are other things in her trial.
I think it's worth pointing out that when we talk of fairy magic, we're not talking about the sort of modern New Age airy fairy, shall we say. We're talking something quite different. I think perhaps we can briefly just talk about the different notions of fairies of sort of medieval times compared to what we talk about today, because it's one of those things that comes up in the sort of New Age circles of fairy magic and unicorns and that kind of thing. This is somewhat different to that, isn't it?
Oh, Lord, yes. I mean, if there's anyone listening out there who has, like, the modern conception of fairy magic, I fully respect your path. Everybody's entitled to their path, and I fully respect yours. However, historic fairies and the fairies that Anna Taylor would have lived with in Rye were a very different thing. They were the product of so many different aspects of culture mashing up against each other. You've got aspects in England of the kind of the Norse mythology and the Danish mythology, bringing these sort of creatures down from Northern Europe, and those are those fairies. They're quite martial, and they're quite dangerous, and they're quite dark. But then you have a little bit of a crossover with fairies and the undead. So fairies are ghosts, and some ghosts, if you don't have them properly sort of ceremonially laid to rest, can become fairies. And if you don't have your dead relatives properly laid to rest, they can end up being kidnapped by fairies after death and become fairies. And then fairies are also demons. And in some of the medieval romances and medieval theological books, fairies pay a tithe to hell every so often, because they're a client civilization of hell. But then equally in other books, fairies are sort of religious. And so in Gerald of Wales's book, You find fairies who are these sort of Christian, God-fearing types that just live in another land. And so fairies are not the cute, cool fairies at the bottom of the garden. They are like us. They live in a world that is barely separated from ours. However, they can be quite retributive. They regularly blind people. They can give you an illness that is not unlike having a stroke. They kidnap our children. They have not always fully consensual sexual relationships with sort of young women found alone in sort of lonely places. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, they are these very sort of dodgy, liminal, sort of quite dangerous creatures. Mm-hmm. But they have huge potential. And so all of this magic, it is very much that Anna Taylor does. It is very magic, but it is very much the sorts of ritual magic you would see done with demons. Mm-hmm. And as you might know, Andy, in VB26, the spell to summon Oberon, it is not a sort of spell where you put all your crystals out and stuff. It is a proper, fairly sort of Solomon tradition invocation where you've got your circle and your tools and you're binding it with god names and being super careful. And it's more that sort of fairy magic that Anna Taylor was doing with a couple of the more folk elements that you see in VB26. So there's one point at which she's got these white sticks she's ramming into the ground. And in VB26 there is a spell like that, and it exists in another manuscript as well, found by Catherine Briggs. And that's to find treasure.
Yes.
And there are fairy names on the sticks. In fact, the whole of the trial is because this woman, Taylor, her neighbour, is basically her Edward Kelly.
Right.
Because her neighbour starts having visions and dreams. And Anna Taylor's trying to push her towards asking the fairies where they'll find buried treasure. Mm-hmm. And sort of they have an altar to the fairies in their house. And she gives offerings to them and that sort of thing.
Right. It's interesting, of course, that we talk about buried treasure. Most people tend to think of sort of pirates and that sort of thing, but it was not uncommon in those times for relatively wealthy people to actually literally bury their wealth underground, because obviously there are no banks, etc., that we have today, to keep it hidden, and then would pass away, and then money would be forgotten about, or the jewels or gold or silver, whatever, would have been forgotten about. So it was a common practice to try and find real buried treasure, and often use magical means. It's one of the things that Edward Kelly had as a kind of a side venture, and often used to go disappearing off, trying to find buried treasure that he believed he'd found or had contact with. And as far as I know, they never found anything, but it was a common thing for old Edward Kelly to go gallivanting off trying to find buried treasure while I spoke to working with Dee. So. Oh,
God, yes, totally. And yeah, the idea of there being buried treasure was a huge part of their popular culture, but also, yes, there really was buried treasure in places.
Indeed.
There really were lost caches of buried treasure. I mean, even in the Great Fire of London, Samuel Pepys buried a couple of things because he couldn't take it with him when he was fleeing London, so he buried it.
Yeah, I think they buried cheese and things like that, which you think, what the hell would you want buried cheese for? But it does actually preserve it quite well if it's well wrapped up.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
And it was quite a large amount, I think, of Parmesan as well.
Yes.
So that would have been quite expensive at the time. Another fairy magician, right, he's one of the two Williams that I studied. And it's annoying for me with my useless brain because they're both William W.
Oh.
And one of them's William Wycherley and the other one's William something else. And basically this chap, he again was a treasure finder using magic, and he was basically a sort of 16th century occult detectorist. Because what he did was learn ritual magic, get all the gear, and then just go around the countryside getting paid by people to do spells to summon spirits like Oberon and to summon the spirits of the dead to try and detect local buried treasure. So yes, no, it was a huge thing, and yes, and Kelly is exactly the right sort of person to be doing it.
Yeah.
This sort of self-educated, slightly outside of society type.
Sort of Arthur Daly, if you like.
Oh, yes.
You remember the TV show?
Oh, yes.
It's a bit outside. Well, we're actually running out of time, believe it or not. This so you've flown by. So where can people discover more about you, John, if you don't mind? If a website, or you mentioned your blog, you by all means let us know what the blog address is.
Oh, yes. Well, if you are interested in my research, if you're interested in learning more about books I've got coming out, then the two places you're best probably going to get a chance to follow me is if you follow my blog, which is jonkaneko-james.com, or if you find me on Twitter, which is John_KJ Writer. And if you follow me there, I post up new blog posts semi-regularly, fairly regularly. And I've got not only this history book coming out in early June, but also later in the year, I've got a fiction series coming out as well. So, yes, follow me for those.
And the book is going to be called This Island is Full of Monsters, or do you think you might be changing the title?
At the moment, it is still This Island is Full of Monsters. Right. And so, yes, keep a lookout for that.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation this evening. It's been absolutely fascinating. We've covered quite a few topics. In fact, there's a couple of topics you wanted to talk about we didn't even get to. So perhaps I'll have to have you back on again another time, if that's all right.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Well, this has been me, as always, with Radio Hermetica, and I'm just going to say good night for everybody, and I will have another show for you next month, as usual. I haven't a clue what it's going to be about. That'll be something I'll work out during the intervening time for that. But thank you very much for listening to Radio Hermetica, and I hope you have a good evening. Goodbye. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.